Hi guys, tonight we're going to step softly into the velvety corridors of ancient Rome, a place of grandeur, ambition, betrayal and shadows cast by flickering torchlight. But instead of telling the well-worn tales of emperors and warriors, tonight we drift into a quieter, darker tale. A tale of women, queens, wives, mistresses and enemies, who shaped the empire not with legions but with whispers, poison, silk and steel. This story is not about virtue, it's about power and the steep cost of wielding it. Over the next 24 parts, we'll travel gently through the lives of women whose names history has marked with unease, from Livia to Messalina, Agrippina to Julia and beyond. Some were villains, some were victims, most were both. Tonight, we begin the journey. Close your eyes, settle in. Let's begin slowly. She was born in 58 BC into a family woven into the very threads of the Republic. Her name was Servilia. And though she would never be empress, never command armies or rule from marble thrones, her shadow loomed large over the most turbulent years of Rome's dying republic. Her son was Brutus. Yes, that Brutus. But her legacy was her own. She was Julius Caesar's mistress. Some whispered his truest love. Others believed she was the one who whispered in her son's ear on the Ides of March. It began as so many Roman tales did, with legacy and politics. Servilia was patrician, descended from a long line of senators. Her father died when she was young, but her family remained connected and calculating. In the complex web of alliances that formed the backbone of Roman political life, marriages were tools. Love was a foreign concept. And Servilia learned early that charm, beauty and intelligence could be more powerful than a legion's sword. When she was married off to Marcus Junius Brutus the Elder, it was not for passion but position. But fate played a cruel hand. Her husband was executed by Pompey the Great for alleged conspiracy. And in that, a flame was lit inside her, the quiet knowledge that loyalty was a game, and betrayal often rewarded the bold. In time, Servilia became the mistress of Julius Caesar. Not just any mistress, the most enduring one. They met in a Rome teetering between tradition and tyranny, and their relationship lasted for years, even as Caesar rose from general to dictator. He showered her with gifts, including a pearl said to be worth 6 million sesterces, a fortune beyond comprehension. Some historians later whispered that Caesar loved her more than he loved power, though few in Rome would have believed he could love anything more than his own ambition. But this was Rome, and in Rome, every connection was political. Servilia's son, Marcus Junius Brutus, was brought into Caesar's orbit, adopted in trust, honoured with titles, but also, possibly, resented. Servilia, ever cunning, may have used her influence with Caesar to ensure her son's advancement. Or perhaps Caesar, in his pride, believed he could shape Brutus into a loyal disciple. As Rome spiraled toward dictatorship, as Caesar marched across the Rubicon and declared war on the very institution Servilia's ancestors had helped build, whispers turned into worries. Senators spoke in hushed tones, knives were sharpened. And all the while, Servilia was there, attending parties, sending letters, speaking softly behind heavy curtains. One tale, perhaps apocryphal, perhaps not, claims that on the Ides of March, as Caesar prepared to enter the Senate, Servilia sent a message to Brutus. Some say it was only a letter. Others believe it was a cryptic phrase. What is happening today is not for your benefit. A warning, a reminder, or a mother's last plea. We do not know. What we do know is that Brutus stabbed Caesar. That Caesar's last words were not et tu, Brute, but a wordless look of betrayal. That Rome, after the death of its most powerful man, erupted into chaos, civil war, blood on the streets, families divided. And Servilia? She survived. She remained in Rome during the fighting. She negotiated with both sides. She tried unsuccessfully to save her son after the tide turned and Antony and Octavian rose. After Brutus fell on his sword at Philippi, Servilia mourned him. But she did not disappear into silence. She remained a presence at the edges of power, even in grief. Why do we begin here with Servilia? Because her story is the story of Rome's women, not just behind the scenes, but at the heart of its violence, ambition and sorrow. She was neither saint nor villain. She was not written into marble, but she etched herself into the bones of an empire. In Servilia, we see how soft power, the quiet kind, could shape history as surely as any battle. And that is what this series is about. As the night deepens and we travel through these stories, we'll meet women like Servilia, Women whose reputations have been twisted, whose motives remain shadowy, whose names have become myths. Some used poison, some used sex, some used silence, all used survival. So, dear listener, rest easy. Let the streets of ancient Rome rise around you, dark alleys, candlelit villas, the murmurs of senators, the rustle of silk. We have 23 more nights together, 23 more women to meet, and so many secrets to uncover. Let us drift forward, slowly. As dawn rose faintly over the 7 hills, Rome itself did not rest, for in its marble veins ran schemes and whispers more persistent than sleep. And now, as our story turns to its next chapter, we draw closer to the centre of imperial power, and to a woman who wielded it with grace, dread, and silent purpose. Her name was Livia Drusilla. When Livia was born in 58 BC, the same year as Servilia's son Brutus, no one imagined the child would one day become the mother of emperors and the symbol of Rome's matronly ideal, and in the same breath, one of the most feared women in its history. Her story began quietly, as so many of these tales do. She was of noble lineage, from the ancient Claudian family, a name that carried weight even before the Republic began to crumble. She was first married to Tiberius Claudius Nero, a relative of high standing but wavering loyalties. He supported Julius Caesar's assassins, and after the fateful Ides of March, he fled with Livia and their infant son, the future Emperor Tiberius, from the wrath of Octavian, Caesar's heir. They lived in exile, drifting like ghosts across the edges of a fractured republic. But fate or ambition called them back. And when they returned, something extraordinary happened. Octavian, not yet Augustus, not yet the first emperor, met Livia. She was still married, still a mother, still a political unknown. But he wanted her. And within months, Octavian divorced his wife Scribonia on the very day she gave birth to his only child, Julia. He pursued Livia without pause, and though she was pregnant with her second child by her current husband, Tiberius Claudius Nero stepped aside under heavy pressure. It was a scandal, it was gossip, but it was done. Livia married Octavian, and so began a partnership unlike any other in Roman imperial history. Unlike the passionate Messalinas or the flamboyant Neros of later years, Livia was poised, controlled. Her influence was whispered rather than declared. She presented herself as the perfect Roman matron, modest, faithful, dignified. She wore simple garments, she wove her husband's clothes with her own hands, or so the stories claimed, and behind the veil of simplicity she helped build an empire. Historians still argue, was she a loyal wife or a subtle manipulator? Was she a queen of shadows or merely caught in the tides of her husband's ambition? What we know is this. For over 50 years, she remained at Augustus' side. She advised him quietly. She stood beside him as he consolidated power and reshaped Rome into an empire, and she outlived him. But not all was tranquil in Livia's orbit. Her marriage to Augustus produced no children. His only child, Julia, born to Scribonia, was married off to Livia's son Tiberius in a union of mutual disdain. Julia, spirited and free, clashed with Livia's rigid sense of decorum. And perhaps, behind her veil of composure, Livia resented her, the woman who would have been the mother to the next emperor, had fate chosen another path. Julia was eventually exiled by Augustus, charged with adultery, accused of licentiousness, and banished to a barren island. Some said it was political necessity. Others believed it was Livia's doing, a quiet removal of a rival line. Then came the deaths. One by one, those with claims to Augustus's legacy began to die. Marcellus, his beloved nephew, perished young. Gaius and Lucius, his grandsons, both adopted and groomed for rule, died mysteriously, one in battle, the other of illness. Agrippa Postumus, another heir, was sent into exile. With each death, Tiberius, Livia's son, grew closer to the throne. There were no accusations. No open suspicion. But Rome whispered, and the whispers grew into murmurs. Did Livia orchestrate these disappearances? Did she poison the line of succession to place her own blood on the throne? Augustus never spoke ill of her. In fact, in his final years, he lavished Livia with honours. He made her his equal in nearly all public ceremonies. She held the title of Augusta, something no Roman woman had ever borne before. She was placed in his will. She was granted unprecedented powers for a woman. And yet, when Augustus died in AD 14, there were stories. One tale, told years later, suggested that Livia kept his death a secret until Tiberius could return from the provinces. that she fed the emperor cold soup as he lay dying, in an attempt to prolong or hasten the inevitable, that she dictated the terms of his passing as carefully as she had guided his life. Tiberius ascended the throne, but the relationship between mother and son soured. Perhaps he resented her control. Perhaps he feared her influence. Livia was now the matriarch of an empire, but she did not die a revered figure. In her final years, Tiberius began to distance himself. He denied some of the honors she requested. He left her letters unanswered, and when she died in AD 29, the Senate proposed that she be deified, a divine figure among gods as Augustus had been. Tiberius refused. He buried her quietly, denied her full honors. Perhaps in the end, even emperors feared their mothers. Was Livia a monster, a Machiavellian genius cloaked in modesty, or was she simply a woman who survived, who learned that in a world of men, silence could be a weapon sharper than any sword? What is most chilling about Livia is not what she did, but what she might have done. The gaps in her story, the missing motives, the unspoken intentions, invite our imagination to wander. And in that wandering, we find something unsettling. Because history, especially Roman history, remembers women like Livia not for their words but for the power they held without speaking. She left no memoir, no confession, only a legacy. And so she remains, not merely a shadow behind Augustus, but the architect of a dynasty, the woman who gave birth to emperors and perhaps to empire itself. The villa that overlooked the Palatine Hill was quiet in the year AD 29. Its walls, once echoing with the footsteps of the imperial court, had become mausoleums of memory. Within its shaded corridors, one name lingered still: Julia, the daughter of Augustus, the woman whom history tried to erase. And yet, her story persists, like a soft wind that stirs the curtains long after the windows have closed. Julia the Elder was born in 39 BC, in a world already unraveling. Her mother, Scribonia, had given birth on the same day her marriage to Augustus ended. The child was taken and the mother discarded, an omen, some would say, for the life that awaited Julia. Raised under the strict hand of Livia, Julia grew into something both cherished and dangerous. She was the only child of Rome's first citizen. She was beautiful, by all accounts. Witty, intelligent, adorned in the finest silks and draped with the invisible weight of her father's expectations. She was, quite literally, the future of the dynasty. But Rome was not built for women to inherit power directly, so Julia's life became a series of marriages, each one a calculated move on the imperial chessboard. First to her cousin Marcellus, Augustus's beloved nephew. He died young, barely out of boyhood. Then to Agrippa, Augustus's trusted general, a man decades her senior. That union bore 5 children, including Gaius and Lucius, heirs to the throne, and Agrippina the Elder, mother of a boy named Caligula. For a moment, it seemed Julia had fulfilled her role perfectly. She had become a mother of Rome's future, a figure of imperial fertility, as statues and poets sang her praises. But after Agrippa's death, Augustus did something strange. He forced Julia to marry Tiberius, Livia's son, a man cold, rigid, and miserable in her presence. It was a union of necessity, not affection. Tiberius loathed her laughter, her cleverness, her independence. And Julia, spirited and restless, did not hide her disdain. She found comfort elsewhere, in parties, in poetry, in wine, and in the arms of lovers. Rome was indulgent in many ways, but Julia's freedoms crossed an invisible line. Gossip bloomed. Jokes were told in the markets. The daughter of Augustus was not merely behaving badly. She was defying the moral purity her father so publicly proclaimed. And then the hammer fell. In 2nd BC, Augustus banished Julia. No trial, no defense, just silence and then exile. She was accused of adultery, though some whispered of deeper plots. Perhaps her circle had plotted against Tiberius. Perhaps the lovers were pawns and Julia merely their scapegoat. Or perhaps Augustus, facing the frailty of age, chose order over blood. She was sent to the island of Pandateria, a barren rock in the Tyrrhenian Sea. There were no courtiers, no luxuries, not even wine, only the salt wind and the cold. Her daughter Julia the Younger would later share the same fate. One by one, the imperial women who did not obey were locked away from the city they had once adorned. In time, her conditions were softened. She was allowed to live on the mainland, but never permitted to return to Rome. Her sons, Gaius and Lucius, both died young, and Agrippa Posthumus, her last child with Agrippa, was exiled and later executed. All that she had built, All that she had borne was buried before her. What makes Julia's story so haunting is its contrast. She had everything: status, beauty, children, admiration, but she lived in a cage woven from expectation. She was the ideal Roman woman only when she was quiet, obedient, and fertile. When she dared to laugh too loudly, to love too freely, the image cracked. And Augustus, her father, the man who crafted the myth of the perfect Roman family, could not allow the illusion to splinter. Was Julia guilty? Perhaps, but if so, she was no guiltier than the men who walked the Senate halls at night, drunk on wine and ambition. What separated Julia was not her behaviour, but her visibility. She was too public, too prominent, too central. And in Rome, power not properly veiled was dangerous. She died in AD 14, the same year Augustus passed. Alone, forgotten. Some say she starved to death after her allowance was cut by Tiberius. Others believe she simply faded, a soul worn thin by isolation. But even in exile, Julia left an imprint. Her descendants would shape the empire's future. Her daughter gave birth to Caligula, her granddaughter to Nero, and though she never ruled, her blood ran through the veins of emperors. Rome tried to forget her, but it never could. She was laughter in marble corridors, rebellion in silk. And she was not the last. For as Rome evolved, so too did its women. No longer confined only to the margins, they began to stir in the heart of imperial power, not as passive ornaments, but as strategists, seductresses, survivors. Julia's tragedy was not her behaviour, it was her timing. She belonged to the twilight of the Republic and the dawn of the Empire, when freedom and fear danced too closely. She was a woman raised with the illusion of liberty, then punished when she believed it. And in her fall, Rome revealed itself. The lamps in the atriums burned low by the time she arrived, small, flickering pools of light casting long, restless shadows against ivory walls. Her name was Lucilla, and she entered the stage of history not as a predator, but as a daughter, a sister, a pawn, and later a conspirator. Lucilla was born in AD 148 to Marcus Aurelius and Faustina the Younger. Royalty carved from marble, groomed to rule not only with power but with principle. Her father, the philosopher emperor, is often remembered as the last of the so-called good emperors. His writings in Meditations speak of virtue, self-restraint, and stoicism. Yet within his own family, virtue was a fragile mask. From the very beginning, Lucilla's life was scripted. At a young age, she was married off to Lucius Verus, her father's co-emperor. It was not a love match. Verus was a man of indulgence, fond of games, gladiators, gold, and women. Lucilla, in contrast, was poised, dutiful, and calculating. But she knew what her role demanded. She bore him children. She appeared at ceremonies. She smiled where smiles were required. And then Verus died, likely of plague, though some whispered otherwise. Now a widow, still young, still beautiful, Lucilla became dangerous. For a Roman woman of imperial blood, widowhood brought a peculiar kind of freedom. She was no longer a girl, but not yet old. And most importantly, she had known power, its fragrance, its texture, its cruel demands. Her second marriage was less illustrious. Marcus Aurelius arranged for her to marry a man named Tiberius Claudius Pompeianus, a respected senator but of no noble birth. Lucilla, proud and imperious, reportedly despised him. To marry a man below her station, even with imperial approval, was an insult too profound to forgive. She obeyed, but never forgot. Then came the storm. When Marcus Aurelius died in AD 180, the empire passed not to an experienced general, nor a statesman, but to his 19-year-old son, Lucilla's brother, Commodus. At first there was hope. Perhaps, some thought, the boy would grow into his role as his father had. But soon the rot revealed itself. Commodus was not his father. He lacked discipline. He bathed in excess, named months after himself, and fancied himself the new Hercules. He dressed as a gladiator, fought in arenas, executed senators for amusement. Rome watched in horror. And Lucilla, watching her brother debase the empire, made a decision. She would end him. We do not know the exact spark that lit the fire, but by AD 182, Lucilla had joined, or initiated, a plot to assassinate Commodus. She was not alone. Several senators, nobles, and even her own daughter were implicated. One of the conspirators, a young man named Quintianus, was chosen to carry out the deed. But the attempt was a disaster. In the crowded corridors of the palace, Quintianus approached Commodus and declared, far too loudly, "Here is what the Senate sends to you." Before failing to strike the fatal blow, he was seized immediately. tortured. The plot unravelled like thread from a torn cloak. Commodus, enraged, did not show mercy. Quintianus and the other men involved were executed without ceremony. But for Lucilla, the punishment was more theatrical. She was first exiled to the island of Capri under heavy guard. Not long after, perhaps fearing another attempt or regretting his earlier leniency, Commodus sent an assassin. Lucilla was killed, quietly, far from Rome, her final breath unnoticed by the city she had once hoped to save. What makes Lucilla's story so haunting is not simply her fall, but her motivation. She had grown up surrounded by marble busts of gods, scrolls of wisdom, and the heavy silence of responsibility. She had seen what good rule could be under her father, and she had watched in horror as her brother transformed the empire into a grotesque parody of its ideals. Her rebellion was not born of ambition alone, it was desperation, and in that desperation she gambled everything. History has not been kind to Lucilla. Her name is often footnoted, a failed conspirator, a jealous sister. But when we look deeper, we see a woman who dared to act, a woman who understood that silence in the face of madness was complicity. She took the risk, and she paid the price. Her brother ruled for another decade, becoming ever more erratic, ever more violent. Eventually he too was murdered, strangled in his bath by a wrestler named Narcissus. His memory was damned, his statues torn down. But Lucilla, though erased in marble, survived in whispers. Because there is something quietly terrifying about a woman who smiles in public but plots in private. Who plays the part of the dutiful daughter, then moves pieces on a board that only she can see. Lucilla was not a heroine. She was not a villain. She was something rarer, a Roman woman who tried to reshape her world, rather than let it collapse around her. In doing so, she entered a long, dangerous lineage of women who refused the role written for them. And in her defiance, she reminded the empire that not all power wears a crown. Some of it waits, silent, patient, until the right moment to strike. The Tiber ran slow that spring. Its muddy waters curled around the city like a whisper too old to decipher. And in the upper halls of the imperial palace, hidden beneath layers of incense and silk, another name was preparing to rise and fall. Her name was Messalina. To the common people, she was a vision of grace. Empress, wife to Claudius, a woman of noble blood and youthful beauty. But behind the marble columns and perfumed corridors, Messalina's story unravelled like something darker, wilder. A tale where love turned into weapon, desire into control, and ambition into a slow, inevitable death. She was born around AD 17, into the Julian-Claudian dynasty, the same web of names that had birthed emperors and gods. She was related to Augustus, to Livia, to Germanicus. In Rome, bloodlines were everything, and Messalina's blood was potent. When she was still a teenager, she was married off to Claudius, a man far older, thought awkward and often mocked. He walked with a limp, spoke with a stutter, and had been passed over for imperial glory most of his life. But history is cruelly ironic. After the assassination of Caligula in AD 41, Claudius was found trembling behind a curtain and declared emperor. Overnight, Messalina became empress. She was only about 15 when Claudius took power. Young, clever, and soon immensely powerful. The court, previously a place of senators and swords, became something else under her gaze, a theatre of favours, of alliances sealed not just with words, but with touches, glances, and threats uttered under the breath. The historians, mostly men, mostly hostile, painted Messalina in lurid tones. Tacitus and Suetonius called her insatiable. They accused her of turning the palace into a brothel, of slipping out at night in disguise to visit taverns and brothels, indulging in pleasures both carnal and calculated. Whether these stories were true, embellished, or fabricated entirely is unclear. But what is undeniable is that Messalina learned quickly how to use the tools Rome gave women: beauty, fear, and proximity to power. Her influence was immediate. People who crossed her were destroyed, exiled, executed, erased. She forged alliances through affairs, secured loyalty with promises, and in time came to hold more sway over the machinery of empire than many senators. Claudius, older and often detached, appeared blind to her manipulations. Or perhaps he saw only what he wanted to see. She bore him children, most notably Britannicus, their son, who was considered the legitimate heir. She stood beside Claudius in public, smiling softly, playing the role of modest matron. But behind that smile, her reach extended into every corner of the imperial court. And then, she overreached. In AD 48, Messalina did something so audacious, so inexplicable, that even Rome paused to question if it were real. While Claudius was away from the city, she staged a wedding. Not a private affair, not whispered in the dark, a public wedding. To another man, Gaius Silius, a handsome senator, already married with his own ambitions. Some say she loved him. Others suggest it was a coup, an attempt to install Silius on the throne and rule as empress in full. Whatever her motives, it was bold and fatal. When news reached Claudius, he was stunned. Betrayal, public and unforgivable. Silius was arrested, dragged to execution. Messalina fled. She sought sanctuary in the gardens of Lucullus, once the site of feasts and triumphs. She waited, hoping for mercy. Claudius hesitated, uncertain even in his fury. But others, Narcissus, his freedman and advisor, acted swiftly. Fearing Claudius might spare her, Narcissus sent soldiers to the garden. They found her trembling, clutching a dagger but too afraid to use it. A soldier took it from her. Then he killed her. She died at 28. Her body was not honoured. Her name was not spoken. Statues were pulled down, memories scrubbed clean. Claudius, grieving or merely shamed, moved on quickly. He married again, and Messalina faded almost. But history remembered her, though not kindly. She became a symbol, a warning, a cautionary tale wrapped in scandal. The name Messalina became synonymous with corruption, lust and manipulation. Poets used her as metaphor. Painters centuries later painted her in sheer silks, surrounded by shadows. And yet if we peel away the moral judgment, another image emerges. A girl raised in a cage of gold. Married young, expected to bear heirs and remain silent. Surrounded by men whose power was never questioned, whose affairs were applauded. And yet, when she played the same game, she became monstrous. Was Messalina a tyrant? Perhaps. Was she ambitious? Undoubtedly. But in a world where women were only allowed to wield influence through seduction and fear, she simply became expert at both. Her story, like so many, was not about virtue. It was about survival. She played the game Rome had written, only she played it too well. The marble floors of the imperial palace were colder now, quieter. Rome had not forgotten Messalina, but it had buried her. Statues melted back into stone. Her name was never spoken within the household of her successor, and that successor was someone just as enigmatic, just as calculating, and far more patient. Her name was Agrippina. But she was not merely Agrippina. She was Agrippina the Younger, daughter of Germanicus, sister of Caligula, niece and fourth wife of Emperor Claudius, and mother of Nero. Her lineage shimmered like a blade, gleaming, dangerous, and sharp enough to cut through the thickets of Roman politics. Born in AD 15, she entered the world as imperial blood poured through her veins, and from the moment she could walk, she understood that she was different. She was not meant to sit still. She was not built to wait. Her mother, Agrippina the Elder, had died exiled and starved. Her father, Germanicus, was a beloved general who died under suspicious circumstances. Poison, many whispered. Her brother, Caligula, became emperor and plunged Rome into madness. And Agrippina, the quiet girl watching from the shadows, learned what power could give and how quickly it could take away. During Caligula's reign, she survived his paranoia, his purges, and his erratic violence. Others in her family did not. Her sister Drusilla died. Her other siblings vanished into prison or disgrace. Agrippina endured. She married, bore a child, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, the boy who would become Nero, and kept her ambitions folded neatly beneath her robes. But survival was not enough. When Caligula was murdered in AD 41 and Claudius became emperor, the path opened. Agrippina returned from exile. Her son, now a boy of promise and cunning eyes, followed close behind. At first, Claudius kept her at a distance. She was watched, tolerated. But Agrippina understood patience in a way Messalina never had, and she waited. In AD 48, when Messalina died, disgraced, executed, a space opened beside the emperor. Claudius, now older and more malleable, required a new empress. Many assumed he would choose someone docile, safe, but Agrippina offered him something better, legitimacy. She was of the Julian line, Augustus's great-granddaughter. She brought with her not only nobility, but a child who could bridge the two greatest bloodlines of Rome. Claudius agreed. In AD 49, he married her, his niece, bypassing traditional Roman taboos. The Senate, pressured by Agrippina's allies, approved the union. Rome watched in silence, half in awe, half in dread. As Empress, Agrippina wasted no time. She became a presence at every meeting, every ceremony. Her name was inscribed on public monuments. Coins bore her image, something nearly unprecedented for a living Roman woman. She sat beside Claudius in state functions, and when he spoke, she listened with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. But her focus, always, was Nero. She arranged his adoption by Claudius. She secured his marriage to Claudius's daughter Octavia, and she ensured his placement above Claudius's own son Britannicus in the line of succession. It was a brilliant, ruthless campaign, and when Claudius began to waver, when rumours spread that he regretted his decision, Agrippina made hers. In AD 54, Claudius died. The official cause, illness. The whispered truth, poison, likely served in a dish of mushrooms, his favourite delicacy. Some said it was slow, others that it was sudden. But all eyes turned to Agrippina, who had stood at his side the night before and who smiled through her tears at his funeral. Nero, only 16, was now emperor, and Agrippina ruled with him. In the early years, she stood as the power behind the throne. Coins depicted them together, mother and son, as if two sovereigns shared the empire. She attended meetings of the Senate, she issued orders, she wore imperial purple. No woman had ever wielded such public authority in Rome. No woman had dared. But sons grow, and emperors chafe under the shadow of their mothers. As Nero came of age, as his tastes hardened and his desires deepened, he grew resentful. He wanted freedom, adoration, and control. Agrippina offered none. She scolded his excesses, rejected his mistress, and reminded him, often, that his crown was her creation. Tensions escalated. She was pushed from his councils. Her guards were reduced. Her title quietly faded from decrees. And then came something darker. Whispers of plots, of betrayal. Agrippina began to fear the child she had raised. Nero, now intoxicated with power, resolved to rid himself of her. He tried first with diplomacy, then distance. And when those failed, murder. One of the most infamous assassination attempts in Roman history followed. Nero arranged for a ship to carry Agrippina from a banquet, a ship designed to collapse at sea. But the mechanism failed. She swam to shore, soaked and furious, and returned home alive. It was an embarrassment, a miracle, some said, an omen. Nero, humiliated, resorted to blunt force. He sent assassins. They entered her villa at night. She knew they were coming. She faced them, according to legend, and uttered her final command, "Strike here," pointing to her womb. The place that had birthed an emperor. They obeyed. Agrippina died in AD 59. Her body was burned hastily. No honours, no mourning. Nero celebrated with games. But Rome remembered. Agrippina was many things, brilliant, ambitious, manipulative, fearless, a woman of mythic composure who built her son into a god, only to be cast aside like an offering. She was not loved, she was not kind. But she was something rarer, undeniable. And when we speak of power, of what it means to hold it and to lose it, Agrippina stands at the centre. Not because she ruled, but because she came closer than any Roman woman before her. She shaped emperors, buried husbands, and for a brief moment ruled the world through silence, strategy, and blood. The corridors of the Palatine Palace still echoed faintly with her footsteps, but Agrippina was gone, burned, forgotten by her son, remembered only by the silence she left behind. And Nero, now untethered, stepped fully into madness. Rome would watch as a boy emperor set fire to his own city, his own name and his own mind, and into this inferno stepped another woman. Not a mother, not an empress, not a seasoned manipulator, but young, beautiful, and fatally ambitious. Her name was Poppaea Sabina. She was born into privilege around AD 30, the daughter of Titus Ollius and Poppaea Sabina the Elder, herself a woman of distinction. Poppaea grew up with all the polish that wealth and status could provide. Tutors in rhetoric, mentors in charm, and an education in the art of court survival. But Poppaea's greatest education was in mirrors. She knew what Rome adored, and she learned to reflect it. Descriptions of her beauty are scattered throughout Roman sources like confessions, translucent skin, auburn hair, pale eyes, and a voice like wine poured over silk. But beauty in Rome was not enough. It had to be weaponized. And Poppaea, with every smile, every tilt of her head, understood that beauty was not a gift, it was a blade. Her early marriage to Ruffius Crispinus, a member of the Praetorian Guard, was strategic but short-lived. It positioned her close to power, close to whispers, close enough to watch. Her second marriage to Marcus Salvius Otho would prove even more instrumental. Otho was a friend of Nero, dashing, reckless and trusted. Through him, Poppaea was introduced to the imperial court, and Nero noticed. Their affair began quietly, then urgently. Nero, already married to Octavia, the daughter of Claudius and stepsister to Poppaea, became obsessed. Octavia was modest, noble and politically popular. But she was not Poppaea. She did not dance through rooms. She did not burn like fire behind the eyes. Poppaea moved into the palace, displacing Octavia in everything but name. And then, slowly, began the erosion. She whispered against Octavia, feeding Nero's insecurity, nurturing his ego and painting his wife as barren, cold, disloyal. The emperor, twisted by paranoia and desire, was seduced not only by Poppaea's body, but by her ambition. He divorced Octavia in AD 62, citing infertility. The people rioted. Statues of Poppaea were torn down in the streets. Rome had loved Octavia, so Nero killed her. First he exiled her, then he ordered her execution. Octavia was only 22. Days later, Nero married Poppaea. She had done it, risen from noble daughter to Empress of Rome. But her story was not a fairy tale. It was a tragedy coiled in silk. As Empress, Poppaea surrounded herself with extravagance. She bathed daily in ass's milk, kept a staff of over 100 attendants just for her personal needs, and ordered pearls crushed into her drinks. Yet she was no fool. She influenced Nero's policies, his appointments, his favours. She was the hidden counsel behind his gilded mask. But love in Rome was a dangerous illusion. Nero's affection was violent, volatile, always teetering toward chaos, and by AD 65 that chaos finally consumed her. Poppaea was pregnant. It was not her first child by Nero. Their daughter had died in infancy, but this time she was further along, carrying what could be the heir to the Julio-Claudian line. Nero was restless. One night, during what may have been an argument, he struck her. Some say with a kick to the belly. Poppaea collapsed. The child died. She died soon after. Nero wept, publicly, lavishly. He ordered her body embalmed with rare spices, placed in a golden coffin and given a state funeral. But Rome and history did not forget the cause of her death. It was not illness. It was not accident. It was Nero. And so Poppaea, the woman who had conquered an empire, not with armies but with glances, who had risen higher than any had dared dream, was reduced, like so many, to ash and memory. Her legacy is stained by contradictions. Some called her wicked, manipulative, others intelligent, poised, misunderstood. But perhaps the truth is simpler. She was a woman of Rome, a city that only pretended to worship its goddesses while punishing every one that dared become divine. She lived as Rome taught her to, with charm sharpened into ambition, desire woven into calculation. She played the same game as the men around her, and for a brief, fleeting moment, she won. But in Rome, victory was always temporary. The air in Rome had changed. It carried the scent of scorched marble and something else, something less tangible, more sinister. After Poppaea's death, Nero grew stranger still. His grief was theatrical, but his eyes were hollow. The city no longer whispered. It watched in silence. But the empire, like nature, abhors a vacuum. And into the void Poppaea left behind stepped another woman, one not remembered for beauty or intrigue, but for something far more chilling. Her name was Locusta. She was not of noble birth, not an empress, not even a senator's wife. She was an herbalist, an alchemist, a woman of poisons. And in the dark underbelly of Rome, where politics was often played with cups rather than swords, she became one of the most feared figures of her age. Locusta had practiced her craft for years before the imperial family called on her talents. Her knowledge of herbs, roots, venoms, and fatal tinctures was unmatched. Wolfsbane, hemlock, belladonna, these were not mere curiosities for Locusta. They were instruments, and she played them like a master. When Agrippina had sought to eliminate Britannicus, Claudius's biological son, and secure her own child's position, it was Locusta who was summoned. The boy, barely a teenager, had been a thorn in Nero's side. Even after Nero ascended, Britannicus remained a symbol of legitimacy, a quiet reminder of what should have been. In AD 55, the emperor held a banquet. It was a celebration, a performance of unity and opulence, and Britannicus was invited. He drank a cup of water, as innocent as any child might. Moments later his body convulsed, he gasped, he cried out, and then he died in front of the court. Nero claimed it was epilepsy. The room remained silent. But beneath that silence, Locusta's name began to circulate. For her role, Nero rewarded her, lavishly. He gave her estates, servants, and protection. He even sent pupils to her, to learn the art of poison, to perfect it as a political science. It was perhaps the first and only time in Roman history that a poisoner became an official imperial asset. Locusta's appearance in the records is brief, but blinding. She became a ghostly presence in the palace, known but never seen. When Nero required discretion, he sent for her. When rivals needed to vanish, she prepared the mixture. Her reputation grew darker with each drop administered. Senators feared her more than generals. She could end a lineage with a single dose. But empires are never stable, and neither are emperors. As Nero unraveled, his tyranny spiraling into paranoia, his pleasures transforming into perversions, Rome began to stir with unrest. Revolts ignited in distant provinces. The Praetorian Guard, once loyal, began to waver. By AD 68, the Senate turned against him. The empire rejected him, and Nero, once the golden boy of the Julio-Claudian line, fled into the shadows. As his world crumbled, so did the protections he had given to those closest to him, including Locusta. After Nero's suicide, Galba seized the throne. He sought to distance himself from his predecessor's grotesque legacy. He executed many of Nero's allies, the artists, the sycophants, the assassins, and Locusta. She was dragged into the light she had always avoided, not tried, not questioned, only paraded through the streets as a warning, a symbol of decadence disguised as expertise. Some say she was burned. Others claim she was torn apart by wild animals in the arena, a final spectacle to satisfy Rome's thirst for justice. And then she vanished into memory. But the story of Locusta is more than a cautionary tale. It is a reflection, a dark mirror held up to an empire that pretended to be governed by law, yet thrived on secrets, betrayals, and silent deaths. She was not evil in the way Rome wanted her to be remembered. She was a consequence. She rose because the empire needed her. She died because it didn't want to admit that truth. And in the shadows of those candlelit halls, where emperors plotted and mothers wept, where cups were passed and lips stained with wine, Locusta's presence lingered. Not a queen, not a lover, not a daughter of a dynasty, just a woman who knew how to make death taste sweet. The ashes of Nero's empire had barely cooled when the year of the four emperors began. Rome turned inward, devouring itself in a frenzy of coups, betrayals, and hurried coronations. In a single year, AD 69, the throne would pass from Galba to Otho, then to Vitellius, and finally to Vespasian, a soldier from the east. The city held its breath. The future was uncertain. And yet, amidst the bloodied steps of imperial transition, a strange calm returned. The dynasty of the Julian Claudii had ended. What emerged in its place was the Flavian dynasty, forged not from the sacred bloodlines of Augustus, but from merit, military loyalty, and a cautious return to order. And with it came a new generation of women, more restrained in image, but no less entangled in the web of imperial power. One of them would become a caution whispered in salons and sculpted in silence, Domitia Longina. She was not born into insignificance. Her father, Gnaeus Domitius Corbulo, was a celebrated general under Claudius and Nero. He was brave, disciplined, and dangerously popular, a combination that, under Nero, meant death. In AD 67, Corbulo was ordered to take his own life. He did so with calm dignity, falling on his sword with the same discipline he had shown in war. His daughter Domitia learned early that favour was fickle, and power was never safe. Despite the stain of her father's death, Domitia remained within the aristocratic circles of Rome. She was first married to Lucius Aelius Lamia, a well-placed senator, but that match was soon dissolved when the emperor's son, Domitian, took interest in her. Domitian, brother of Titus, son of Vespasian, was not the heir Rome wanted, nor the one it expected. He was cold, calculating, and profoundly insecure. But he was also clever. And when he rose to power in AD 81, after the death of his brother, he brought Domitia with him, his wife, his empress, and for a time, his muse. Their relationship was volatile from the beginning. Domitia was elegant, intelligent, and known for her sharp tongue. She was not content to merely be an ornament at Domitian's side. She had opinions, and worse, she had presence. At first, Domitian seemed entranced. He celebrated her publicly, minted coins with her image, and styled her as the divine consort of the emperor. For a brief moment, she was Rome's new Livia, a guiding hand, quiet but powerful. But Domitian was not Augustus. He was paranoid, cruel, and increasingly obsessed with betrayal, real or imagined. The first rupture came when Domitia bore him a son. The child died young. The loss unmoored the emperor further. Soon after, rumours spread of Domitia's alleged affair with the actor Paris, a famed performer beloved by the Roman public. No one could confirm the truth. The line between scandal and invention in Rome was always thin, but Domitian believed, or chose to believe. Paris was executed, brutally, publicly. Domitia was exiled. Some claimed she was sent to a countryside villa under heavy guard. Others said she was confined within the city, living under a silent, bitter shame. But years later, inexplicably, Domitian brought her back. Perhaps he missed her. Perhaps he realized that in Rome, appearances mattered more than reality. Or perhaps he simply had no one left he could trust. She returned not with joy, but with caution. The palace had changed. Domitian's tyranny had worsened. Senators feared entering his presence. Informers roamed the halls. Executions were ordered on whispers. And Domitia, once empress in grace, became empress in name only. Her final act, if the sources are to be believed, was as chilling as it was ambiguous. In AD 96, Domitian was assassinated in his own bedroom. The plot involved members of the Praetorian Guard, palace officials, and his own freedmen. But some sources, always cautiously, always quietly, suggest Domitia played a role. They say she knew. They say she unlocked the door. They say she let the killers in. If true, it was the final expression of imperial vengeance, the quietest kind. A woman betrayed by love, humiliated by power, choosing to become an accomplice in its destruction. After Domitian's death, the Senate rushed to erase him. His name was condemned, his statues toppled, his memory damned. But Domitia survived. She was not executed. She was not exiled again. She simply lived on. Older, quieter, watching as Rome moved on without her. She never remarried. She never publicly spoke of her time as empress. And when she died, years later, her name still carried the chill of shadow. People remembered her not with affection, but with awe. She had walked the knife's edge of power and survived. Not unscarred, but intact. Domitia Longina was not a seductress. She did not poison rivals. She did not dance through scandal. She was something rarer. A woman who lived in the lion's den, and though wounded, walked out with her dignity. And that, perhaps more than beauty, charm, or ambition, was her legacy. The dusk of the Flavian dynasty settled over Rome like the long exhale of an aging lion. Vespasian was gone, Titus had died too soon, and Domitian, paranoid and brutal, had fallen to blades behind a locked door. In the twilight that followed, Rome did not crumble. Instead, it breathed again, softly. The Senate reclaimed its voice. The air grew less heavy. Into this fragile dawn emerged the Nerva-Antonine dynasty, an era that posterity would one day call the Golden Age of emperors. Men like Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius led the empire with what appeared, from a distance, to be wisdom and grace. There were no assassinations in these years, no mad tyrants, no emperors who fancied themselves gods in flesh. But beneath the surface, the story was not so serene. Even in times of quiet rule, the shadows persisted. The throne remained dangerous. And in the court of Hadrian, traveller, philosopher, builder of walls and temples, a woman lived whose silence became her defence and whose mystery has never fully lifted. Her name was Vibia Sabina. She was born around AD 83, the daughter of Lucius Vibius Sabinus and Salonina Matidia, who was herself the niece of the Empress Plotina, wife of Trajan. From childhood, Sabina moved within the upper echelons of Roman life. She was refined, educated, and watched closely. But not for her own sake, for her future. Her marriage to Hadrian was arranged by Plotina, who adored the young man with the trimmed beard and Greek ideals. Hadrian was a rising star in Trajan's court, known for his sharp mind, his charm, and his ambition cloaked in modesty. Sabina, barely a teenager, was given to him not as a gift, but as a strategic binding, a seal of blood and allegiance to unite two powerful branches of the imperial family. From the beginning, the union was brittle. Hadrian did not love Sabina. That much is clear in every surviving record, every whispered account. He admired her, perhaps, respected her lineage, but there was no intimacy, no warmth. The emperor's heart was turned elsewhere, most famously toward a young Greek boy named Antinous, whose beauty and tragic death would one day inspire temples, statues, and a cult that stretched from Egypt to Britannia. Sabina remained empress, but not companion. She travelled with Hadrian during his long imperial tours. She walked beside him through the cities of the East, through Athens and Alexandria, through the archways of newly constructed aqueducts and forums that bore his name. She stood silently while he honoured Antinous with godhood, while he wept over the Nile, while he commissioned marble likenesses of the boy to adorn temples where her own image never appeared. Still, she endured. Coins were struck with her likeness. The people saw her as serene, regal. But behind the sculpted eyes of the silver effigies was a woman caught in a paradox, elevated beyond comprehension, yet trapped in a role she did not choose, in a life she did not shape. There were no scandals linked to Sabina, no accusations of adultery, no affairs, no conspiracies. And yet her distance from Hadrian grew starker as the years passed. Some sources claimed she begged for a divorce. Others suggested Hadrian kept her secluded, away from the court. The truth, as with most imperial stories, is unclear, deliberately so. Hadrian himself once remarked that Sabina had been irritable and moody, a passive condemnation. But he did not divorce her, he did not exile her, he did not kill her. Instead, they existed together as two figures carved from different stones, co-rulers in name, strangers in truth. She bore no children. The imperial line, once expected to pass through her womb, was instead constructed through adoption. Hadrian chose Antoninus Pius, and then Marcus Aurelius to carry the torch. Sabina became a vessel unused. In AD 136, she died. Hadrian mourned her with ceremony. He deified her, statues were raised, temples consecrated. But was it love or duty, or simply a pageant for the Senate and the gods? No letters survive, no personal writings, not even a whisper in the diaries of courtiers or slaves. Sabina left no voice behind, and perhaps that is what makes her so haunting. She did not conspire like Agrippina, nor seduce like Poppaea. She did not poison, plot, or rebel. She simply lived, high above the world, behind layers of silk and marble, until she vanished into divine silence. Her face, on coins, still stares with distant calm. Her statues, found in dusty villas and forgotten gardens, show a woman serene, untouched, unknowable. But beneath the polished stone lies something deeper, a loneliness unspoken, a life written for her in others' ink. Sabina was not wicked, nor good. She was imperial, and in her stillness she revealed a different kind of power, not the kind that conquers or commands, but the kind that endures, even when forgotten. The reign of Antoninus Pius passed like a gentle tide, so steady that Rome nearly forgot what turbulence felt like. No assassinations, no poisonings, no scandals echoing through marble halls. It was a reign of calm, reflection and construction, both of monuments and moral expectations. Rome prospered. The empire stretched contentedly from the green hills of Britannia to the shifting sands of Arabia. And during this placid interlude, one woman rose quietly, like ivy creeping up a temple wall, slow, unnoticed, but enduring. Her name was Faustina the Younger. Born in AD 130, Faustina was the daughter of Antoninus Pius and Faustina the Elder. From her earliest days, she was wrapped in silk and expectation, the living emblem of dynastic continuity. She was not only noble, she was imperial by blood and destined to become imperial by marriage. That marriage, orchestrated with the precision of a military campaign, was to Marcus Aurelius, her cousin, her father's chosen heir, and the man who would come to be remembered as the philosopher emperor. Stoic, thoughtful, detached. In many ways, he was the still centre of a world spinning too quickly. But if Marcus Aurelius was the marble face of reason, Faustina was its breath, vivid, unpredictable, and fiercely alive. She entered her role not as ornament, but as partner. From their union sprang a family of astonishing size. Faustina bore at least 13 children, though only a few survived into adulthood. Among them was Commodus, the son who would one day drag the empire into fire. To the public, Faustina was celebrated. She was hailed as Mater Castrorum, Mother of the Camps, a title never before given to an empress. She travelled with Marcus on his military campaigns from Gaul to the Danube, enduring cold tents and muddy marches instead of lounging in ivory courtyards. The soldiers loved her. They saw her not as a distant noblewoman but as one of their own, a matron who endured hardship beside them. But in Rome, whispers curled like incense in the dark. Accusations drifted from house to house, cloaked in plausible deniability, that Faustina was unfaithful, that her son Commodus was not Marcus's child, that she took lovers among the gladiators and officers, that her passions ruled her more than decorum. And Marcus, always composed, always rational, never addressed the rumours publicly. Instead, he honoured her. He built temples in her name, statues, inscriptions. He praised her virtues in his meditations and letters, always gently, always with reverence. Whether this was love, duty, or the deliberate suppression of scandal for the sake of imperial image, no one can say. Perhaps it was all three. Faustina, for her part, never apologized for being seen. She did not cloak herself in invisibility as some empresses had done. She appeared in public, dressed not lavishly but proudly. She oversaw charities. She acted as patroness to artists and philosophers. She was not docile. She was present, and that presence frightened some. Rome had always been uneasy with women who refused to be silent. Faustina's influence, political, emotional, symbolic, was immense. She was everywhere. And that, in the eyes of the elite, made her dangerous. Her death came suddenly in AD 175, while accompanying Marcus Aurelius during yet another campaign. The exact cause is lost to time. Some say illness, others claim exhaustion. She was only in her mid-40s. Marcus was devastated. He declared her a goddess. Founded the city of Faustinopolis in her honour, near the site of her death. He had coins minted, bearing her image wreathed in laurel, inscribed with the word eternitas, eternity. But even in death, the rumours did not fade. Centuries later, Roman historians, often writing with sharpened pens and sharper agendas, would continue to malign her. They painted her as licentious, scheming, adulterous, the archetype of the imperial wife who masked personal excess behind public duty. And yet not one accusation was ever proven. No trial, no exile, no official condemnation, perhaps because Marcus knew and did not care. Or perhaps, like so many women of power, Faustina simply refused to conform to the version of history others tried to write for her. She was not like Sabina, silent and distant. She was not like Messalina, reckless and exposed. Faustina was something else, alive, passionate, complicated. A woman of flesh and ambition, not marble and myth. She bore an emperor. She mothered Rome's next sovereign. She stood at the emperor's side not in ceremony but in campaign. And when the fires of war crackled outside their tent, it was said that Marcus read by torchlight, while Faustina mended cloaks by hand. Together they ruled, and together they built a legacy that was as human as it was imperial. In the end, Faustina's greatest transgression may have been that she was too real, too vivid for a city that preferred its empresses cold and still. Her story, though twisted by centuries of gossip, remains, not in statues, but in the way she forced Rome to look at a woman and see not just a name, but a life. The wind over Rome shifted once more. From the stoic calm of Marcus Aurelius came something stranger, not a storm, but a spectacle. The empire, so long defined by discipline and balance, now found itself enthralled by chaos dressed in gold. For Marcus was dead, and his son had taken the throne. Commodus. The name alone would later evoke unease. He fancied himself Hercules reborn, wielding a club instead of a sceptre, appearing in the arena rather than the Senate. The philosopher's son had become a performer, a god-king, adored and feared in equal measure. And behind the painted face of the emperor stood a woman with no official title, no coin struck in her name, no statues raised in her honour. But her presence, dark, silent, commanding, shaped the rhythm of Commodus's rule more than most ever knew. Her name was Lucilla. But not the Lucilla of the early empire, the sister of Commodus, executed for plotting against him. This Lucilla was different. She was not noble by birth. She was a concubine, a mistress, a shadow. And yet in the strange, inverted court of Commodus, shadows often held the strongest sway. We do not know exactly when she entered his life. The records, already sparse from that period, treat her like a rumour, something acknowledged but never defined. What is known is that after the death of Empress Brutia Crispina, executed or exiled under dubious charges of adultery, Commodus did not remarry. Instead, he allowed his personal life to drift inward, toward comfort, toward loyalty, toward Lucilla. She became the closest thing to an empress without ever wearing the title. And in the twilight haze of Commodus's increasingly erratic reign, Lucilla became indispensable. Not for diplomacy, not for spectacle, but for her proximity. She was there when Commodus withdrew from the affairs of state, when he replaced seasoned advisors with flatterers and freedmen, when he renamed the months of the calendar after himself. When he appeared in the arena, oiled and bare-chested, slaying animals before a captive, horrified aristocracy. Through it all, Lucilla remained. And perhaps that was her power, not in steering the empire, but in remaining the still point around which the madness spun. Some claimed she whispered to him, that she alone could calm his rages, guide his whims, dull the edge of his paranoia. Others believed she was the fuel for his fantasies, feeding his delusions of divinity, encouraging him to believe he was not a ruler of men, but of fate itself. But Lucilla, whatever role she played, left no letters, no records, no heirs. She lived in the spaces between spectacle and state. In time, Commodus's erratic behaviour became more than embarrassment. It became threat. The Senate seethed, the army grew restless, the Praetorian Guard, once loyal, began to weigh their options. And still, Lucilla remained. But survival in Rome is rarely permanent. In the final months of Commodus's reign, the court became a boiling pot of fear. Murders, accusations, executions with no trial, a growing list of enemies real and imagined, and eventually, inevitably, the blade turned inward. In December of AD 192, a conspiracy emerged from within his own household. His mistress, Marcia, another woman who had risen from concubine to near empress, discovered her name on an imperial death list. Alongside hers were the names of Latus, the Praetorian prefect, and Eclectus, a powerful freedman. Together they acted. Marcia offered Commodus a cup of wine, laced with poison. When the poison failed to kill him, a wrestler named Narcissus was summoned. Commodus was strangled in his bath. The actor emperor, the gladiator king, died not in battle, not in the arena, but in silence, under the weight of his own court's betrayal. And Lucilla? She disappeared from the records, as if she were never there. Perhaps she was killed alongside the emperor, lost in the purges. Perhaps she vanished into the countryside, taking with her the memories of madness. Or perhaps she never existed at all, not as a single woman, but as a collection of names. Lucilla, Marcia, Crispina, folded into one figure. A feminine presence always at the side of power, never quite within its grasp. What remains is a figure in the background, watching as the emperor performed, waiting as the city held its breath. She did not write laws or lead armies, but she endured. And in Rome, that alone was a kind of power. The year of Commodus's death was not only the end of a man, it was the end of a bloodline. The Julio-Claudians were gone, the Flavians were buried. And now, with Commodus murdered in his bath, the throne sat empty once more, gleaming and cold, waiting for the next hand bold or foolish enough to reach for it. Rome would not wait long. In the days that followed, the city convulsed with uncertainty. The Senate named Pertinax emperor, a noble and austere man, but he was murdered within months by the very guards meant to protect him. The Praetorian Guard, emboldened by the rot of years, then auctioned the throne to the highest bidder. Literally. Didius Julianus paid for the empire in coin, not blood, but blood would come anyway, and from the provinces rose 3 claimants, each backed by legions. Septimius Severus was one of them, a general from Africa, hardened, quiet, and immensely ambitious. By AD 193, he had marched on Rome, claimed the throne, and begun to reshape the empire in his own image, martial, calculated, and fiercely dynastic. It is within this new era that another woman emerged, one whose legacy would ripple forward through war, empire, and infamy. Her name was Julia Domna. Born around AD 160 in Emesa, Syria, Julia was not Roman in the traditional sense. She came from a noble priestly family. Her father was a high priest of the sun god Elagabal. Her youth was spent among incense and ritual, amidst the desert light and shadows of Eastern temples. She was educated, fluent in Greek, and deeply philosophical. In a city that loved words and power, Julia carried both. When she married Septimius Severus, it was not merely a union of passion, it was strategy. Severus was rising in rank. He needed a wife who could navigate courts as deftly as he maneuvered armies. Julia proved more than capable. She bore him 2 sons, Caracalla and Gaeta. And with their birth, she sealed her place not just as consort, but as matriarch of a dynasty. When Severus seized power, Julia followed him across the empire, not as decoration, but as companion. She wore armor over her robes. She held court while the emperor fought. She corresponded with philosophers and jurists, debated with scholars, and built alliances not through seduction, but through intellect. She was not the first Roman empress from the East, but she was the first to bring the East into Rome itself. They called her Mother of the Camp, like Faustina before her. But Julia was not maternal in softness, she was maternal in discipline. She created her own circle within the palace, a group of intellectuals, scientists, physicians, and rhetoricians who advised her, dined with her, and shaped imperial policy as much as any senator. It was said her dinners were symposiums of wit and strategy. She spoke rarely in public, but when she did, her words were deliberate, chosen with the precision of a surgeon's knife. And then, in AD 211, Severus died in York. Julia was now a widow, but unlike most Roman widows, she did not retreat from power. Her sons, Caracalla and Geta, were declared co-emperors, and Julia, their mother, stood between them, mediator, advisor, and shield. But blood, once spilled into imperial lineage, never stays contained. The brothers hated each other. Their rule, meant to be shared, quickly soured. Caracalla, impatient and brutal, made a decision. In the palace, under the pretense of reconciliation, he invited Geta to a private meeting. Julia was there, caught between them. And before her eyes, Caracalla's men attacked. Geta was cut down, blood staining the silks of his mother's robes as she screamed. Caracalla would later claim it was for the good of the empire. Julia did not protest. She did not raise an army, did not rally senators, did not mourn publicly. She remained at court, distant, composed. And as Caracalla reigned alone, wild, vengeful, and increasingly detached, it was Julia who kept the machine of the empire running. She handled correspondence, she received petitions, she mediated disputes among generals and provincial governors. She became, in essence, the silent emperor. But time frays all threads. In AD 217, Caracalla was assassinated by his own soldiers during a campaign in the east. His death left Julia alone again, but this time there was no son to prop up. The throne was taken by Macrinus, a former praetorian prefect with no noble blood. Julia was no longer needed. She was ordered to Antioch, far from the capital she had once ruled in all but name. There she received word that her influence was no longer welcome. Her body weakened, some say from illness, others from refusal to eat. In the final days she surrounded herself with scrolls and silence, and then she died. Alone, in exile, her legacy heavy in the air. But Julia Domna would not be forgotten. Through her, the Severan dynasty persisted. Her relatives would claim the throne. Her image remained in marble, serene and sharp. And in the centuries that followed, as the empire fractured and reformed, her name lingered, not as scandal, but as steel. She had ruled not through seduction or spectacle, but through intellect, through will, through endurance. And in a city that had always feared powerful women, Julia Domna had become the one they could not dismiss. The dust had not yet settled over the eastern provinces when the Severan legacy began to claw its way back to power. Julia Domna was gone, but she had left behind something potent, not only the memory of her rule, but the bloodline that still whispered of divine right. And in the cracked marble silence of a crumbling imperial court, another woman would rise to carry that legacy forward. Her name was Julia Maesa. She was Julia Domna's older sister, born in Emesa, like her, among the incense and gold of the sun god's temple. Where Julia Domna had married an emperor and ruled with measured intellect, Julia Maesa had waited. She had watched. She had endured. And now, in the chaos that followed Caracalla's assassination and Macrinus's shaky reign, she saw a gap that could be filled not with a man, but with her grandchild. Julia Maesa had two daughters, Julia Soemius and Julia Mammaea. Both had sons. And those sons, born in the east, raised in the glow of temples and surrounded by whispered prophecy, were more than heirs. They were weapons. The first, Elagabalus, was a high priest of the sun god Elagabal. At just 14, he was tall, beautiful, and enigmatic. And Julia Maesa, ever the strategist, began to circulate a claim that Elagabalus was not merely her grandson, he was the secret son of Caracalla. The people murmured. The legions in Syria stirred. Gold was given, promises were made, and within months, the eastern troops declared the boy emperor. Macrinus, lacking lineage and loyalty, was swept aside like dust from a mosaic floor. By AD 218, Elagabalus entered Rome. He brought with him incense, foreign gods, perfumes, and chaos. The city gasped. He wore silks instead of togas. He painted his eyes. He danced in temples. He paraded through the streets in golden chariots, accompanied by priests, musicians, and exotic animals. He replaced Jupiter, the supreme god of Rome, with Elagabal, a black meteorite housed in a grand temple built on the Palatine Hill. The Senate watched in horror. The people whispered behind closed doors, but Julia Mesa stood firm. She had not orchestrated the downfall of an emperor, bought the loyalty of a legion, and carried her grandson to the throne just to let scandal undo them. She moved through the corridors of the palace like a silent flame, unspoken but always near. She advised Elagabalus, shielded him, even as his behavior became more provocative, more incomprehensible. The boy emperor took male lovers openly. He was said to have worn bridal gowns, to have offered fortunes to any physician who could transform his body into that of a woman. He married and divorced multiple wives. He married a Vestal virgin, breaking one of Rome's most sacred taboos. His reign was not merely eccentric. It was a ritualistic upheaval of Rome's entire cultural foundation. Even Julia Maesa, for all her power, could not shield him forever. By AD 221, she saw the empire turning. The Praetorian Guard, once loyal, was murmuring. The Senate was sharpening its knives. The people had grown weary of incense and spectacle. And so, in a move as cold as it was strategic, Julia Mesa turned to her other daughter, Julia Mamaea, and her other grandson, Severus Alexander. Severus was only 13, quiet, obedient, and Roman in every way Elagabalus was not. Maesa orchestrated his adoption by Elagabalus, naming him heir. And then she waited. The boy emperor, sensing betrayal, tried to reverse the decision, but it was too late. In March of AD 222, the Praetorian Guard struck. Elagabalus, just 18 years old, was dragged from the palace and slaughtered alongside his mother Julia Soaemius. Their bodies were thrown into the Tiber. The cult of Elagabal was dismantled. Temples were rededicated. The foreign gods were exiled once more. But Julia Maesa remained untouched. She had sacrificed a daughter and grandson to preserve the dynasty, and she had succeeded. Her younger grandson, Severus Alexander, was now emperor. Her influence, though quieter, remained. She did not seek titles. She did not command armies. She simply continued, advising, guiding, manipulating where needed. She had seen 4 emperors rise and fall. She had outlived them all. She died a few years later, her legacy already secure. And yet, history rarely remembers Julia Maesa with the reverence it affords generals and senators. She left behind no grand orations, no laws, no monuments with her name carved deep in stone. But her fingerprints are everywhere in the Severan dynasty. She was the architect of survival, the guardian of a fading line, the quiet force that bent empires to her will. Where Julia Domna had ruled through intellect, Julia Maesa ruled through blood. Spilling it, preserving it, wielding it as both shield and blade. And in Rome, where blood was currency, hers was worth more than gold. The streets of Rome, once perfumed with incense and golden processions, were subdued now. The garish days of Elagabalus were over. The empire yearned for calm, for predictability, for something that felt like Rome again. And so the city turned to a child, soft-spoken, gentle-eyed, the polar opposite of his flamboyant predecessor. Severus Alexander, barely 14, became emperor. But behind him, guiding every decision, every appointment, every letter sealed with imperial wax, stood his mother, Julia Mamaea. If Julia Maesa had been the architect of the dynasty's survival, Julia Mamaea was its guardian. She had watched her mother raise and lose a grandson. She had witnessed how quickly the empire turned on those it could not control, and she had no intention of making the same mistake. Where Elagabalus had burned too brightly too quickly, Alexander was moulded into an ideal, disciplined, temperate, visibly Roman. But his throne, though golden, was fragile. His youth made him vulnerable. And so Julia Mamaea stepped forward, cloaked not in armor, but in the authority of a mother protecting an empire. She surrounded her son with scholars, philosophers, and legal minds. Ulpian, the famed jurist, became his advisor. Administrative reforms were enacted, corruption punished, discipline restored to the military. Coins were minted with Alexander's face, but Rome understood. The hand that guided the empire belonged to Julia Mamaea. She ruled through him, but never let go of the reins. Unlike her mother, Julia Mamaea did not rule from the shadows. She made herself visible. She accompanied her son in ceremonies, sat beside him during audiences, and even appeared on coins, her profile sharp, dignified, crowned with the title Mater Augusti. She was no mere matron. She was empress in practice, if not in name. But Rome, ever suspicious of women in power, began to whisper. Senators grumbled that she meddled too much. Generals chafed at her presence on campaign. She vetted decisions as if the purple belonged to her. And worse, she was cautious. Too cautious. When the Persian Empire stirred to the east, Alexander and Julia Mamaea travelled with the army to the frontier. The campaign was slow, diplomatic rather than decisive. Victories were minor. The troops, hungry for conquest and glory, grew restless. Many blamed her. She urged negotiations. The soldiers wanted war. And when the empire turned its gaze north, toward the Germanic tribes crossing the Rhine, things unravelled. In AD 235, Severus Alexander and Julia Mamaea marched to Gaul. Once again, she insisted on diplomacy, on paying the invading tribes for peace. The soldiers, already weary of restraint, saw it as weakness, cowardice, dishonour. Among them rose a man named Maximinus Thrax, a general of humble origin and brutal ambition. He whispered to the legions that the boy emperor was soft, that his mother ruled from behind veils, that Rome needed a soldier, not a scholar. The army agreed. In a cold camp near Mainz, they proclaimed Maximinus emperor. Julia Mamaea and her son fled to their quarters. There were no guards left, no loyalists, just walls, silence, and inevitability. The assassins came swiftly. They murdered Severus Alexander first. No defense, no resistance. And then Julia Mamaea, who had ruled for over a decade, was cut down beside the child she had shaped into a god. Their bodies were left exposed. The dynasty ended there, not with a revolt, not with a palace conspiracy, but with a mutiny, crude, merciless and final. History would not weep for her. Later writers would dismiss her as overbearing, manipulative, too entangled in the affairs of men. But those same historians rarely acknowledged the difficulty of what she achieved. Ruling an empire through wisdom rather than force, maintaining order in a time of decay, preserving civilization at the edge of collapse. She was not beloved, but she was effective. And when the light of her influence was extinguished, Rome was plunged into its 3rd century crisis, a half-century of chaos, fractured rule, and ceaseless civil war. Julia Mamaea's flaw was not her ambition. It was that she tried to civilize a world that had already chosen violence. She trusted philosophy where the empire demanded fury, and for that, Rome turned its back on her. But in the dark corners of marble halls, her memory lingered, not in triumph, but in discipline, in law, in the quiet echo of a woman who dared to rule not like a man, but as a mother who never let go. Rome had always walked a tightrope stretched between order and chaos. But after the fall of Julia Mamaea and her son, the balance shattered. The empire plunged into a crisis that would stretch for decades, a whirlwind of emperors proclaimed and murdered, of borders breached, of cities abandoned and rebuilt. It was a time when the sword replaced the law, and when power passed not through bloodlines, but through military whim. In this age of upheaval, women did not vanish, they adapted. Some withdrew, some endured, and a few stepped forward, not into palaces, but into legends. Among the most enigmatic of them was Zenobia. She was not born in Rome. Her breath first touched the desert air of Palmyra, a wealthy caravan city in the Syrian sands. The daughter of nobles, perhaps of royal lineage, she was raised among marble columns and incense-filled halls, where Greek, Aramaic, and Latin mingled as easily as merchants and philosophers. She studied Homer. She read Plato. And from a young age she spoke with a quiet certainty that unnerved even her elders. Her full name was Septimia Zenobia, and though her blood may not have been Roman, her ambitions would soon rival the Caesars. She married Odeanathus, the powerful ruler of Palmyra and a loyal ally to Rome. Together, they governed a region critical to the empire, its eastern flank always threatened by the Persian frontier. When Emperor Valerian was captured by the Sassanids in AD 260, it was Odeanathus who rose to defend Rome's honour. He pushed back the Persians, reclaimed lost lands, and styled himself Corrector Totius Orientis, protector of the entire East. Zenobia watched it all, listened, learned. And then, in AD 267, Odeanathus was assassinated under murky circumstances, along with his eldest son from a previous marriage. The child of Zenobia, her own son Vabalathus, was still young, too young to rule, so she did. At first, Zenobia claimed only guardianship, a mother acting in the name of her son, a regent, nothing more. Rome, distracted by rebellions in Gaul and invasions along the Danube, allowed it. After all, Palmyra remained peaceful, prosperous and loyal on the surface, but beneath the silks and smiles, Zenobia was building something else, a kingdom, an empire. She expanded her forces, strengthened alliances. Her armies, disciplined and battle-hardened, began to move, first to Egypt, then to Arabia, and finally to much of Anatolia. By AD 270, she controlled nearly the entire eastern third of the Roman world. She did not declare independence, not openly. Coins were minted with her son's face on one side, and Aurelian's, the reigning Roman emperor, on the other. But slowly, Rome faded from those coins, and Zenobia's image replaced it. She called herself Augusta. Her court in Palmyra was a glittering fusion of East and West. Philosophers, generals, poets, and scientists gathered under her rule. She was said to ride with her armies, to walk among her people unveiled, to speak multiple languages with clarity and ease. She was neither submissive nor severe. She was sovereign. Rome, already fraying at its seams, could no longer ignore her. In AD 272, Emperor Aurelian marched east. He was no fool. He did not underestimate Zenobia. He approached with force, but also with diplomacy. He sent envoys, offered terms. Zenobia, perhaps believing her position stronger than it was, refused. War followed. The battles were fierce. Zenobia's generals fought valiantly, but Rome's legions, led by one of its most capable commanders in generations, were relentless. One by one, her cities fell. Her army shattered at Emesa. And finally, as she attempted to flee to Persia for aid, Zenobia was captured on the banks of the Euphrates. Palmyra surrendered. Her fate, like much of her life, is cloaked in contradictions. Some say she was paraded through Rome in golden chains, stoic, unbowed, a captive who refused to weep. Others claim she was granted a villa in Tibur, allowed to live in comfort, quietly fading into history. There are even stories that she remarried, raised daughters, and became a Roman matron in all but name. But the image that lingers is older, sharper. Zenobia, standing on the walls of Palmyra, her eyes fixed on the horizon, not in fear, but in calculation. A woman who dared to carve an empire from the bones of another, who spoke like a scholar, ruled like a general, and dreamed like a sovereign. Rome labelled her a usurper, but to the desert, she was a queen. Perhaps even something more. A vision of what power might look like when wrapped not in marble, but in the endless sweep of sand and sky. The desert winds that once carried Zenobia's banners now carried only silence. Palmyra, her glittering court of philosophers and marble colonnades, had returned to the dust. Rome reabsorbed what it could not forgive. But even as Zenobia faded into quiet legend, the empire she had challenged stumbled onward, bruised, stretched thin, and more vulnerable than it had ever been. The 3rd century had nearly broken Rome. Plagues, invasions, civil wars, emperors rising and falling like waves in a storm. And then came Diocletian. He did not restore the Republic. He did not feign sentiment for a vanished Senate. Instead, he embraced what Rome had become, an empire of absolute power. He remade the state, split its rule among 4 emperors, and surrounded the throne with distance, ritual, and divine titles. The dominate had begun. In this colder, more formal Rome, women reappeared not as queens or consorts, but as anchors, unseen, often unnamed, yet vital to the illusion of stability. And yet there was one who would break through the mist of anonymity, one who would stand on the edge of 2 worlds, old Rome and the new Christian empire rising from its ashes. Her name was Helena. She was not born noble, not raised in a villa with fountains or sent to tutors fluent in Greek philosophy. She was, by most accounts, the daughter of an innkeeper, possibly in Bithynia, possibly in Dalmatia. Her youth is obscured, wrapped in contradiction. Some claim she was a serving girl, others a stable hand's daughter, but what no one disputes is that she was chosen by a man named Constantius Chlorus, a rising soldier in the imperial legions, destined to rule. He took Helena not as a wife. Rome's laws prevented such marriages between nobles and commoners, but as a concubine. And from this union, a boy was born, Constantine. For a time, Helena faded into the background. Constantius rose through the ranks, became Caesar under Diocletian's tetrarchy, and was given a noblewoman to marry, Theodora, stepdaughter of the Emperor Maximian. Helena was cast aside, not violently, but decisively. She was not killed, not exiled. She was simply removed from view, as so many women were. But her son was not. Constantine was raised near the centre of power, watched carefully, educated like a prince. And Helena, though distant from court, never vanished from his life. When Constantius died in AD 306 and Constantine was proclaimed emperor by the legions in York, he summoned his mother, and from that moment forward she rose. No longer the concubine in shadow, Helena became nobilissima femina, the most noble lady. Her image appeared on coins. Her name was etched into public decrees. She held the ear of the emperor. And her influence would reach farther than most imagined, because Helena had changed. Somewhere along the way she had embraced a new faith, quietly at first, the faith of a crucified Jew from Judea, a religion still illegal, still whispered in catacombs. But Constantine, facing civil war after civil war, saw what she saw. Christianity was no longer a fringe sect, it was a force. In AD 312, on the eve of battle against his rival Maxentius, Constantine claimed to have seen a vision, a cross of light in the sky, bearing the words in hoc signo vinces. In this sign, conquer. He won the battle. Entered Rome not as a usurper, but as a redeemer. Soon after, the persecution of Christians ended, and Helena, by then in her 60s, was not content to remain idle in the palace. She became Rome's first imperial pilgrim. Draped in imperial robes, surrounded by guards and clerics, she travelled to the Holy Land. There she searched for the places where the man she now called Saviour had lived and died. In Jerusalem she visited Golgotha. Excavations were ordered, and according to legend, Helena uncovered the very cross upon which Christ had been crucified. She had churches built over these sacred sites, the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. These structures still stand, aged but defiant. Helena returned to Rome not as a queen, but as a saint. She died around AD 330, her son at the height of his power, preparing to move the empire's capital to Byzantium. Later, the church would canonize her. Pilgrims would pray at her tomb. Her name would echo through centuries of Christian devotion. But her story, like so many, was shaped in the crucible of Rome. She had begun as a concubine. She ended as the mother of the first Christian emperor. Helena did not wield armies or broker treaties. She offered something else, quiet perseverance. Faith carried not in decree, but in action. And when the world changed, when the empire tilted toward the cross, she was already there, waiting in the shadows, holding the threads of something older than Rome and destined to outlive it. By the time Helena was laid to rest in a sarcophagus of porphyry, the world she had helped shape was shifting underfoot. Her son Constantine stood as the first Christian emperor, and the empire, once built upon Jupiter and Mars, now bowed before the cross. Temples were being rebranded as churches, and martyrdoms were no longer carried out in the Colosseum, but remembered in scripture and stone. Yet power, true imperial power, still followed the ancient paths. Still walked palace halls, whispered behind veils, passed from hand to hand in the language of blood. And as the light of Constantine began to fade, another woman stepped forward, not through soft faith or quiet diplomacy, but through bloodline, cunning, and cold resolve. Her name was Constantina. History would come to know her better as Constantia. She was the eldest daughter of Constantine the Great. Born sometime in the early years of his reign, she grew up not in the fading glory of Rome, but amid the growing splendour of the Eastern court, Nicomedia, Trier, Byzantium. She was educated, fluent in both Latin and Greek, and raised not only as a princess but as a symbol. Constantine had sons to carry swords, but Constantina carried something subtler: imperial continuity. Her first marriage was a move on the imperial chessboard. She was given to Hannibalianus, a cousin of Constantine, and declared Rex Regum, King of Kings of the Eastern Territories. The title was ceremonial, the gesture was not. Constantine intended to rebuild the East under his banner, and Constantina was to be its empress. But dreams built too quickly often collapse. In 337, Constantine died. The empire cracked into three, split between his sons, Constantine II, Constantius II, and Constans. In the blood-stained days that followed, rivals were executed with terrifying efficiency. Among the dead was Hannibalianus. Constantina, newly widowed, survived. How she managed it, how she navigated the treacherous corridors of the palace while others were being dragged from their chambers and cut down, is unknown. But survive she did, and soon she found a new position of power. She married Constantius Gallus, her cousin, a member of the surviving branch of the Constantinian dynasty. The marriage was not simply about union, it was about control. Gallus was named Caesar, ruler of the East under her brother Constantius II. But it was Constantina who understood the politics of Constantinople, who whispered to officials, who maneuvered with the ease of someone raised in the shadow of her father's ambition. Together they ruled Antioch, and for a time they ruled well. But ambition does not sleep, especially in Rome. Gallus, once pliable, began to act independently. He conducted purges, he executed senators, he gathered support among the army. Whether Constantina encouraged his rise or merely tolerated it is unknown, but she benefited. She was given honours. Coins were struck in her name. Her image was carved into ivory panels and passed through the hands of governors and generals. She became more than consort. She became presence. And then the balance tipped. Constantius II, threatened by his cousin's growing influence, summoned Gallus to the west. It was a trap. The young Caesar was arrested, tried in secret, and executed in AD 354. A slow, silent purge followed, names erased, supporters exiled. The Eastern court, once gilded in Constantina's presence, was stripped bare. But Constantina was spared. Why? Perhaps because she was the emperor's sister. Perhaps because she pleaded. Perhaps because once again she had seen the blade coming before it struck. She returned to court, not in disgrace, but in silence. There she proposed a new union. One that would cement her place once more. A marriage, not for herself, but for the future of the dynasty. Her candidate was a young philosopher general named Julian. Another cousin, distant, bookish, unlikely, but useful. Constantius II agreed, and so Constantina became the bridge between one era and the next. She brought Julian into the imperial family. She handed him legitimacy, and in return she hoped to shape him, but she would not live to see it. In AD 354, shortly after the marriage, Constantina fell ill, perhaps to fever, perhaps to poison. She died at Cani Gallicani, outside the imperial court, far from the pageantry and the polished stone that had marked her life. Her body was brought to Rome. She was buried with honours in a grand mausoleum built by her father near the Basilica of St. Agnes. The rotunda still stands, its mosaics dimmed but intact. For centuries it would be known as the Church of Santa Costanza, sanctified not by sainthood but by memory. Because Constantina, unlike Helena, was not sainted. She was remembered as imperial, commanding, sometimes cruel. Later, Christian writers accused her of vanity, of manipulation, of excessive pride, but what they could not deny was her resilience. She outlived 2 husbands, survived one of the bloodiest successions in Roman history, and shaped the course of 2 emperors. She did not pray for power, she wore it, wrapped in silk, shrouded in strategy, moving across the empire like a shadow cast by the legacy of Constantine himself. The shadow of Constantine stretched long across the empire. His name, once whispered in reverence, now echoed like a fading anthem in the marble corridors of a world teetering between 2 identities, Rome and Byzantium, paganism and Christianity, legacy and upheaval. The sons and daughters he left behind continued to jostle and fracture the imperial crown like a golden relic passed between reluctant heirs. And as men grappled for power, women remained the quiet architects of survival. Among them rose one whose role would be defined not by temples or coronations, but by the most intimate arena of imperial politics, the domestic palace. Her name was Justina. She was not born into the first dynasties of Rome, nor did her name carry the thunder of old Julian blood. But her life would entwine with emperors and bishops, with war and doctrine, in a way that would shape the spiritual and political fate of the Western Empire. Justina first emerged from the mists of imperial history as the second wife of Valentinian Fund, a soldier emperor hardened on the frontiers, raised from the ranks of the legions, and known for both his military prowess and volcanic temper. His first wife had died young, leaving a son, Gratian. But Valentinian, aging and calculating, needed more, a second marriage to secure his dynasty. He chose Justina. Beautiful, composed, and from a respected Roman family, she was more than a consort. She was opportunity. She gave him a son, Valentinian II, and in doing so secured a second branch of imperial succession. But the world into which her child was born was no longer the world of Augustus or Trajan. It was a fractured empire, pulled apart by rival generals, provincial governors, and warring faiths. When Valentinian first died suddenly in AD 375, rage surging in his chest during a confrontation with barbarian envoys, Justina's world changed overnight. Her son was only 4. And so the Empress became regent. It was not a title she bore officially. Rome had no place, no name for female rule. But in the palaces of Milan and Trier, it was Justina who chose advisors, appointed bishops, negotiated alliances. Gratian, Valentinian Hua's son by his first wife, ruled the West formally. But Justina ensured her own son remained co-emperor, if only on parchment. And she governed with an awareness born not of ambition, but necessity. Yet what marked her rule, what enshrined her name in the bitter chronicles of Roman bishops, was not politics, but faith. Justina was an Arian. In an empire increasingly dominated by Nicene Christianity, orthodox in creed, spearheaded by fierce bishops like Ambrose of Milan, Arianism was a theological threat. It denied the full divinity of Christ, placing him below God the Father. For bishops like Ambrose, it was not a harmless interpretation, it was heresy. And yet, for Justina, it was truth. She supported Arian priests, appointed them to courts, allowed them to hold services in public, and when she requested the use of a basilica in Milan for Arian worship, the city erupted. Bishop Ambrose refused. He barricaded the church. The people rallied behind him, and so began a war of will. Justina, Empress and Regent, commanded the imperial guard to take the basilica by force. Ambrose stood before the doors, unarmed. The soldiers did not advance. Whether out of fear or piety, they stepped back. It was not merely a religious standoff, it was a confrontation between two powers once thought indivisible. Church and state, woman and priest. And Justina lost. Ambrose's victory became legend. The Nicene faith triumphed, not by sword, but by defiance. And Justina, once secure in her regency, found her position eroded. Gratian grew distant, favouring Nicene clergy. The East offered little support. Her enemies multiplied. In AD 383, Gratian was assassinated in Gaul by the usurper Magnus Maximus. Justina fled with her son Valentinian II to Thessalonica, seeking protection from the Eastern Emperor Theodosius I. There she negotiated, pleaded, manoeuvred. Her son's rule was acknowledged, though only as a junior partner under Theodosius's shadow. She did not return to Milan. She did not live to see her son's demise, strangled under suspicious circumstances in the year 392. She died quietly in exile, and yet Justina's legacy endured. To Christian chroniclers, she became a symbol of arrogance, a woman who dared defy the church, a heretic dressed in imperial robes, but beneath the vitriol a different image emerges, a mother who ruled alone. A woman who dared to hold authority in a time that refused her name for it. A regent who played a dangerous game in an empire where truth and doctrine had become weapons sharper than any gladius. Her name would be overshadowed by saints and emperors, but in the soft candlelight of crumbling basilicas, in the footnotes of imperial councils and exiled clergy, she remains, etched in quiet defiance. Not as an empress who sought glory, but as one who held a crumbling world together for as long as it would allow. By the time Justina's story had passed into the wary ink of bishops and scribes, Rome itself had begun to shift on its axis. Not merely from the weight of invaders or the decadence long blamed for its decline, but from a new reality forming just beneath the surface. A world where the empire no longer ruled minds, only territories. Faith now shaped the future. Not armies, but doctrine. Not emperors, but bishops. Yet even in this reshaping of history, there remained women, on the edge of the sacred and the imperial, who refused to be erased. And none were as potent or as complex as Galla Placidia. She was born around the year 388, the daughter of Theodosius I, Emperor of the East and eventual unifier of the entire Roman Empire. Her mother, Galla, was Justina's daughter. Thus, through both blood and tragedy, Galla Placidia stood at the intersection of two imperial worlds, Western ambition and Eastern orthodoxy. From childhood she lived among opulence tempered by fear. Palaces, yes, but always with locked doors. Imperial processions, but watched from balconies, not ridden at their front. The empire was no longer safe for its own heirs. The generals who guarded them often eyed the throne with the same hunger as those who opposed it. When Theodosius died in 395, the empire split once more between his sons, Arcadius in the east, Honorius in the west. Galla Placidia, still a child, was sent to the western court in Ravenna, a city surrounded by marsh and sea, defensible, remote, and already whispering of decline. She grew up in this isolated world, watched the throne become a toy for generals, and learned to survive by listening. But nothing prepared her for what came in 410. The Visigoths, led by Alaric, sacked Rome. It was the first time in 800 years that the Eternal City had been breached. The world recoiled. Pagans claimed it was divine punishment for abandoning the old gods. Christians wept and invoked martyrdom. The Western Empire, already flailing, now appeared broken beyond repair. And in the chaos, Galla Placidia was taken. She was captured by Alaric's successor, Ataulf, and brought with him as the Goths roamed the shattered territories of Italy and Gaul. But what might have been a simple hostage story became something else. Ataulf fell in love with her, the barbarian and the Roman princess. And Galla Placidia, ever the realist, perhaps fell in love with him too, or perhaps she merely saw opportunity. In 414 in Narbonne the two were married, a Roman ceremony, imperial rites, and for a brief moment it seemed a new empire might be born, not through war, but union. They had a son. They named him Theodosius after her father. It was a declaration, a dream that East and West, Roman and Goth, might find common blood. But dreams in Rome did not last. The boy died in infancy. Soon after, Ataulf was assassinated. Placidia was captured once again, this time by Roman forces, and returned to Ravenna. But she returned not as a prisoner. She returned with wisdom, with scars, with a knowledge of the shifting tides of power. And now her brother Honorius, weak and isolated, needed her. He married her off to Constantius III, his most powerful general, a man of ambition and control, but not cruelty. Together they had 2 children, Justa Grata Honoria and a son, Valentinian III. In 421, Constantius was named co-emperor, but he died within the year. Honorius followed him in death in 423. And suddenly, Galla Placidia, twice a widow, once a prisoner, sister to a dead emperor, stood alone at the edge of an empire with only her young son between her and oblivion. So she ruled. Not in name, not at first, but in everything that mattered. She navigated court politics with a surgeon's eye. She leveraged her ties to the Eastern court to secure her son's recognition as Western emperor. She governed from Ravenna, but kept an eye always on Rome, on Constantinople, on the swirling eddies of ambition in every province. She raised Valentinian III to rule. She steered military campaigns. She negotiated with bishops. And perhaps most significantly, she built churches, basilicas. She commissioned the famous mausoleum of Galla Placidia in Ravenna, a small cross-shaped building adorned with mosaics that still shimmer to this day. Its ceilings glow with blue and gold stars, with saints marching along the walls, their expressions serene, eternal. It is one of the oldest Christian monuments to survive intact, a testament to her legacy, not carved in conquest, but in faith and architecture. She died in 450, her son now emperor in name, but not truly in control. Rome would fall just 26 years later. But Galla Placidia's story is not one of loss. It is one of improbable survival. She lived through the sack of Rome, the death of 2 husbands, the collapse of old imperial lines, and the slow death of a pagan empire. She was captured, restored, remarried, and regent. She ruled as both bridge and barrier between 2 collapsing worlds. And when the history of Western Rome closes, her name is among the last still spoken with reverence. Not as a woman who held power for its own sake, but as one who carried it when no one else could. The 5th century had pulled Rome into a twilight it could no longer escape. The Western Empire, once a colossus of law and legions, was now a patchwork of brittle alliances, puppet emperors, and fading titles. Its centre no longer held, the city itself was no longer sacred. In this dimming world, power moved not in Senate decrees, but on the blades of mercenaries and the whispers of courtiers. And yet, even as emperors came and went, some reigning only months, others only in name, one woman's influence wove steadily through the collapse. Her name was Justa Grata Honoria. She was the daughter of Galla Placidia and the sister of Valentinian III. Born into the shivering heart of a dying empire, Honoria was raised, not in expectation of glory, but in the suffocating weight of survival. Her mother, the Empress Regent, had shielded her family through invasions, assassinations, and the corrosive politics of Ravenna's court. Honoria learned early that in Rome's final days, power was a matter of proximity and silence. But Honoria was not her mother. Where Galla Placidia had been controlled, deliberate, a master of negotiation and endurance, Honoria was something else entirely, fiery, impulsive, and unafraid of risk. She did not wish to become a pawn. She did not wish to be married off to another fading general or bureaucrat in exchange for temporary loyalty. She wanted agency. She wanted escape. And so she acted. In her early 20s, Honoria became embroiled in scandal. She had taken a lover, a chamberlain named Eugenius. When discovered, the court erupted in fury. The affair was not simply illicit, it was dangerous. A woman of imperial blood, unmarried, bearing a child out of wedlock, could challenge the fragile legitimacy of her brother's reign. Eugenius was executed. Honoria was placed under heavy guard. Talk of exile was whispered, but Honoria did not retreat. Instead, in a gesture that would alter the course of history, she sent a plea for rescue. A letter. Sealed with her ring, it was addressed not to a Roman noble, nor to a provincial governor, but to a barbarian king, Attila the Hun. The same Attila who had razed cities along the Danube, who had sent the Eastern Empire into terror, who had become a myth of destruction even before his death. The man Rome feared most. In the letter, she offered herself, perhaps as a bride, perhaps as a pretext. Along with her plea, she sent a ring. Historians would debate for centuries what exactly she meant. Was it an official marriage proposal, a symbolic gesture of alliance, or a desperate cry from a woman cornered by her own blood? Attila took it at face value. He proclaimed that Honoria was now his betrothed, and with her he claimed half of the Western Roman Empire as dowry. Valentinian III was horrified. He denied the proposal, insisted Honoria had acted without sanction, and tried to bury the incident in diplomatic ash. But Attila was not dissuaded. He began preparations for war. In 451 he invaded Gaul. His army, an unstoppable tide of Huns, Scythes and Ostrogoths, pushed westward. The empire, fractured and desperate, rallied what it could. Aetius, Rome's last great general, formed an uneasy alliance with the Visigoths. The Battle of the Catalonian Plains followed, one of the bloodiest confrontations of late antiquity. Attila was forced to retreat, not defeated, but delayed. The following year he invaded Italy. Cities burned. Northern provinces were abandoned. Ravenna prepared for siege. And again, the spectre of Honoria's letter hung in the air like a dagger half drawn. It is unclear what became of her after that. Some say she was exiled to a convent, silenced behind stone walls. Others believe she was executed quietly, her name erased from court records, her crime too great to forgive. No tomb bears her name, no statue recalls her likeness. But her gesture had changed everything. With a single letter, Honoria pierced the illusion that the Roman Empire still controlled its fate. She forced Rome to see itself not as master of the world, but as prey circling its predator. And in doing so, she also revealed the desperation of imperial women, those born into silks, yet shackled by dynastic expectation. She was not plotting to rule. She was not grasping for a throne. She was trying to survive. And in the last flickers of Rome, that was perhaps the most dangerous ambition of all. The Western Roman Empire, by the mid-5th century, was no longer an empire in truth, but in name, hollowed from within, propped up by foreign generals and ever-shifting treaties. Its armies were mercenaries, its emperors figureheads, and its territories fragmented like the reflections of a shattered mirror. Ravenna remained its capital, but even its walls echoed with a silence that sounded like an ending. Yet even as the imperial structure collapsed, women at its margins continued to wield influence, sometimes indirectly, sometimes with startling clarity. And among the last to rise in this twilight was a woman born of Rome, yet bound to its enemies. Her name was Eudoxia. She was not raised in shadow. She was not a concubine or the daughter of a provincial governor. Eudoxia was royalty, born Licinia Eudoxia, granddaughter of Theodosius I, daughter of the Eastern Emperor Theodosius II and the formidable Aelia Eudocia. She was educated in Constantinople, tutored in Greek and Latin, raised with both Christian piety and imperial pride. Her name alone, evoking justice and divine favour, promised dignity and strength. At 17, she was married to her cousin, Valentinian III, the Western Emperor. Their union was designed to heal the widening crack between the Eastern and Western courts. And for a time it seemed to work. The young empress travelled west, crossing a crumbling world to enter Ravenna's decaying palaces, where she would stand at the heart of a government already rotting from within. Valentinian III was weak, indulgent, easily swayed. He preferred ceremony to action, and his reign, though long for the time, was defined more by inaction than reform. The true ruler of the West was the general Flavius Aetius, a man of iron discipline and grim necessity. Eudoxia watched all this with the studied silence of a woman who understood that to speak too soon was to die too early. But cracks widened. In 454, Valentinian, perhaps jealous of Aetius's influence, murdered him with his own hand during a private audience. The court was stunned. The army enraged. The following year, Valentinian himself was assassinated, cut down in the streets of Rome by soldiers loyal to Aetius's memory. And Eudoxia was left a widow. She had 2 daughters, Eudocia and Placidia. No sons, no clear claim to the throne. The Western Empire, already teetering, plunged into chaos, and Eudoxia, desperate to secure her daughters' futures, and her own, made a decision that would shock the world. She reached out to the Vandals, the same Vandals who had crossed into North Africa, seized Carthage and declared a rival kingdom. The same Vandals who had captured Roman fleets and launched attacks on Sicily and the southern coasts. Their king, Genseric, had long demanded that his son, Huneric, marry into the imperial line. Eudoxia now agreed. She sent a message, perhaps a plea, perhaps a pact, inviting the Vandals to come and claim what was promised. Genseric, already poised for conquest, needed little encouragement. In 455, his fleet landed in Italy. Rome, defenceless and fractured, surrendered without a fight. And so, 45 years after Alaric, the city of Rome was sacked again, this time by Vandals, not Visigoths. For 2 weeks, they looted palaces, stripped temples, emptied the treasury. Yet, despite the violence of their arrival, no wholesale massacre followed. Genseric kept a measure of restraint. Some claimed it was Eudoxia's influence. Others said it was negotiation or divine intervention. When the Vandals departed, they took more than gold. They took Eudoxia and her daughters. They were transported to Carthage, not as prisoners in chains, but as captives of honor, symbols of a victory Genseric could parade before the world. There in exile, Eudoxia lived under a strange fusion of luxury and surveillance. Her daughter Eudocia was married to Huneric, binding the Vandal king to Roman imperial blood. In time, the marriage would bear a son, Hilderic, who would become king of the Vandals and tilt that kingdom toward Rome once more and toward Christianity as the empire knew it. Eudoxia, through her bloodline, had planted a seed. Eventually, she and her younger daughter Placidia were allowed to return to Constantinople. The Eastern court received her with caution, wrapped in propriety and ceremony. But the damage was done. The Empress, who had once walked the basilicas of Rome, was now a living emblem of the empire's fall. Her name faded from official histories. She had broken the sacred bond between Rome and its enemies. Or perhaps she had simply made visible a truth long buried, that the empire was no longer ruled from within, that its fate rested in foreign hands. Eudoxia's life was not marked by rebellion or cruelty. She poisoned no rivals. She plotted no coups. But her desperation, her willingness to cross the line between Roman and barbarian, shifted the course of history. She did not destroy Rome, but she helped reveal that it had already destroyed itself. As the 6th century unfurled across the fractured remnants of the Western Empire, it became clear that Rome, as it had once existed, was no more. What remained was memory. Marble reduced to rubble, roads overtaken by wildflower and weed, temples turned into churches, and emperors reduced to regional rulers or names in fading parchments. Yet while the West lay in disrepair, the East thrived. Byzantium, Constantinople, stood brilliant, unyielding and increasingly powerful. From its polished halls emerged a new kind of imperialism, one wrapped not in the glory of legions but in the splendor of divine right. The emperor was no longer merely princeps, first among equals. He was Basilius, anointed by God, shadowed by saints, enthroned in the shimmering mosaic of heaven itself. And into this vision stepped one of the most controversial women in all of Roman, now Byzantine history. Her name was Theodora. She was not born of noble blood. There were no imperial lineages or senatorial uncles in her past. Her father was a bear trainer for the hippodrome in Constantinople. Her mother, a performer. When her father died, Theodora's family teetered on the brink of poverty. Her mother, desperate, dressed her daughters as supplicants and brought them into the hippodrome to beg for their father's old position to be granted to another man. From there, Theodora's life diverged sharply from what might have been a quiet obscurity. She became an actress. But in Byzantine society, that word carried meanings far beyond the stage. The line between performance and prostitution was thin, often non-existent. Theodora, still a girl, grew up amid the filth and frenzy of public theatres, taverns and pleasure houses. Her beauty was said to be arresting, her wit sharper still. She danced, recited risque comedy, and entertained men of all ranks. By the age of 16, she was infamous. And yet something else stirred within her, a hunger not just for survival, but for transformation. She left Constantinople. She travelled to North Africa, possibly as the companion of a provincial governor. There, something shifted. She began to study, to listen, to question. She encountered Christians, perhaps of the Monophysite sect, and adopted a form of personal piety that did not erase her past, but reframed it. When she returned to the capital years later, she was no longer a courtesan. She had remade herself. And then fate intervened. The most powerful man in the empire, Justinian, heir to the throne, met her. The details of their courtship are blurred by time and bias. But one thing is certain, he did not see her as others did. He saw a partner. Against the conventions of the court, against the disgust of the Senate and the horror of the aristocracy, Justinian married her. She was crowned Augusta in 527, the day he became emperor. And so Theodora ascended. She entered the palace not as a passive figurehead, but as co-ruler. She attended state councils. She influenced foreign policy. She funded religious houses and hosted foreign dignitaries. Justinian himself once said, "My thoughts are incomplete without her counsel." Their relationship was not only personal, it was political, intellectual, strategic. But Theodora's true moment came in crisis. In 532, Constantinople erupted in the Nika riots, an uprising born from factions in the Hippodrome but stoked by political discontent and anger at imperial policies. The city burned. Senators plotted. The people shouted for a new emperor. Justinian wavered. He prepared to flee the city. But Theodora did not. In the most famous speech ever attributed to her, she addressed the court. "Those who have worn the crown should never survive its loss. I will not flee. Purple makes a fine shroud." Her words stiffened Justinian's spine. He stayed, and with his general Belisarius he crushed the rebellion, killing tens of thousands. Theodora's will had saved the empire, but her reign was not without shadows. She suppressed heretics and dissenters. She oversaw brutal crackdowns on those who threatened the regime. Her support for the Monophysite sect placed her at odds with the Orthodox clergy, and her past was never forgotten by those who despised her rise. Yet she never denied it. She walked the corridors of the great palace with the quiet authority of someone who had survived the filth of the streets. She funded institutions to protect women from sexual exploitation. She offered asylum to abused wives. She legislated for greater protections for actresses and former courtesans. Her life had taught her that power without mercy was tyranny, but mercy without power was surrender. She died in 548, likely from cancer, at the height of her influence. Justinian mourned her deeply. He never remarried. He continued his campaigns, the reconquest of Italy, the construction of Hagia Sophia, but her voice, once so close to his own, was gone. The mosaics in Ravenna's Basilica of San Vitale, completed after her death, show her standing in imperial robes, haloed in gold. She is not shrinking in the background. She is centered, radiant. Theodora remains one of history's most divisive figures. Villain to some, saint to others. But beyond the bias and the gossip, there stands the image of a woman who rose not through inheritance but through fire, who ruled beside an emperor not by grace but by grit, and whose life was not a fairy tale, but something more enduring, a testament to transformation. When Theodora passed from the living world, she did not vanish. Her legacy, engraved in marble and immortalized in mosaic, lingered like perfume in the basilicas of Ravenna and the echoing halls of the great palace. The empire she had helped fortify endured, shining, brilliant and brittle, as Byzantium edged toward its golden age. But history, never content with simple endings, continued to make space for women who would rule, guide, and haunt its chapters. The centuries that followed produced no shortage of empresses and consorts. Some ruled in ceremony, others in substance. But few wielded the kind of raw, unflinching power that would emerge generations later in the figure of Irene of Athens. She was not born into greatness. Her family, while noble, held no throne. Her origins are vague, her early years poorly recorded. But by the 8th century, the Byzantine court had become a place where uncertainty was no weakness, it was camouflage. Irene entered history as a bride. In 769, she was selected to marry Leo IV, son of Constantine V, a marriage chosen for her beauty, her Greek lineage, and perhaps her usefulness. She was young, 16, perhaps younger. Leo was more than her husband. He was the heir to an empire roiled by theological upheaval. Iconoclasm. The movement to strip churches of icons, to destroy paintings and mosaics of Christ, the Virgin, and the saints. To purify worship through austerity. Leo's father had enforced it with violence. His court had become a battleground of broken images and shattered traditions. Irene, though quiet at first, watched carefully. She bore Leo a son, Constantine VI, securing her position. But even as empress, she never truly ruled. Not yet. When Leo died in 780, her moment arrived. Her son was only 9, too young to reign. So Irene took the reins. At first, she ruled as regent, but she did not fade into the expected role of maternal guardian. She appointed generals, reorganized the palace, purged her enemies. She restored icons to churches, held religious councils, and summoned bishops to affirm the orthodoxy of veneration. Her reversal of iconoclasm enraged former allies, but it also endeared her to the devout and the artistic. Monasteries bloomed once more. Frescoes returned to domes. She was called Augusta, but not everyone accepted her authority. As Constantine VI came of age, pressures mounted for Irene to step aside. A son must rule, the court murmured. A woman cannot wear the purple alone. Irene resisted. When her son attempted to assert himself, she undermined him. He was weak, she said. He lacked judgment. By 790, Constantine had managed to push her aside. Briefly, within a year, Irene returned to power, now as co-regent once more. The court fractured. The army stirred. And in 797, Irene made her final move. She ordered her son seized. His eyes were gouged, blinded, a punishment that symbolically and practically made him unfit to rule. He died from the wounds, though the court never confirmed it. And Irene, mother of the last male heir of the Isaurian dynasty, ascended the throne as regent, not as co-ruler, but as emperor, not empress. Emperor. She adopted the male title Basilius, the first woman in Byzantine and Roman history to rule in her own name without husband or son. The court gasped. The West recoiled. Pope Leo III, unwilling to acknowledge a woman as emperor, crowned Charlemagne as Emperor of the Romans in 800, igniting a new chapter in the long tension between East and West. Irene's rule was now challenged not only by internal rebellion but by the redefinition of empire itself. Still she held on. Her reign, though marked by intrigue and violence, also saw revival. The treasury was stabilized, art and theology flourished, and for 5 years she ruled alone from the golden throne of Constantinople, wrapped in silks, her face framed by pearls, her commands sealed with imperial ink. But time has no favorites. In 802, court officials turned against her. She was overthrown by her own finance minister, Nikephoros, and exiled to the island of Lesbos. There, in a dim monastery, she lived out her final months not as a ruler, but as a woman whose name was already turning to legend. She died in 803. No monument marked her grave. But her story, fragmented, mythic, defiant, remained. Irene of Athens did what no Roman woman had ever done. She did not advise. She did not guide from behind a veil. She took the diadem, sat on the throne, and claimed the world as her own. History remembers her with ambivalence. A tyrant, a usurper. A mother who mutilated her son. But also a sovereign, a patron, a restorer of icons, a woman who ruled when the world told her she could not. And in doing so, she joined a lineage of women who had walked the edge of power, balancing on the knife's point between empire and exile. The worst women in Roman history, they were called. But perhaps they were simply the ones who refused to be forgotten.